I'm going to talk today and give you an update on the National Wellbeing Service. I think it's 3 or 4 years since I last came to the Supers Conference and gave quite a personal perspective on wellbeing, which I think, listening to some of the things that have been going on here, there's been a big shift in people feeling comfortable to disclose things about their own personal journeys around that, which is really good. And I'm going to give you an update on the National Service, because I think it's important for people operating in senior executive positions, well, it's critical actually, that you get a look at what we are developing. We've had a live service since March, April this year, and I'm going to talk through what sort of things we're delivering. And then I'm going to focus on really what our role is in this is in terms of leadership, and some of the insights that we've got from our own staff's experience. All of us in this room will have experienced these things, but I think the difference between now and 4 years ago is we have got a very, very good picture, because of the research that's been done, the stuff that we've learned around the lived experience of what it takes to thrive in a blue light environment, and particularly policing. So these are a few of the people who, just to get across that all our national work, we're very fortunate to have not just UK experts, but leading experts. Dame Carol Black in the middle, I know she spoke at a conference. She is the main government advisor around wellbeing and resilience. Mike Cunningham asked to set up the National Working Group 5 years ago. Professor Carrie Cooper is the grand fromage of wellbeing, as we like to call him. These people are fascinated to work with us because we experience extremes in the workplace, absolute extremes. And, you know, compared to people in other working environments, there are some like ours, this is second highest trauma exposed occupation in the world. We are higher in trauma exposure than the military because they rotate out of theatre. And that is research that Dr. Noreen Tarani's done. An average person in their lifetime will probably experience 3, maybe 4 traumatic events. You know, I'm talking about not just the death of a loved one, but really traumatic events. Research will show that police officers, some police staff, paramedics, you know, some of those will experience 600 to 800 throughout the career. And you can see that happening, I think, even more so in the front line at the moment. Linda Hindle, Public Health England, a lot of our initial work and continued research is supported by Public Health England. And Ian Hesketh, who I know many of you will have heard speak, who's an ex-police inspector who works very closely with us. He's in the college at the moment and on the main team. So we were kicking along really with quite a small little outfit doing the blue light framework. We were unfunded, we had a bit of money from Public Health England, and then we were requested to set up a national service. And that has been quite a big job to put in place. First of all, we had to find out what it is that we wanted to do. We worked with people who are experts in a whole system approach to delivering wellbeing. Armed forces, a lot of the commercial sector, and we have developed our whole service based on what is accepted good practice. But Dame Carol Black will say that we are one of the few organisations that she knows of that have got a sector-specific, tuned-in approach to this, rather than just picking something off the shelf and saying that works in my organisation, because of the experiences of our people. So what do we want to achieve? We are focused on, and we're pretty ruthless at trying to stick to this, it's got to be scalable, it's got to be affordable, it's got to be high quality, and it's got to be personalised. If you can't do that, particularly if you can't do it affordably at scale, it's not that it isn't adding value, it's that we cannot push it out across our system. And you'll see when I talk through some of our live services how we are aiming to achieve some of those whole population objectives in terms of the national service. You know, our national service really works for employers. It works for employers and the people in policing. It isn't a place people go if they've got a problem. It is a place where we say this is what good looks like, and we can help you deliver really great organisational wellbeing. And I'll talk through the live services. So we've got 8 live services running at the moment and 2 projects which I'll touch on afterwards. The first one is line management and leadership. So feeding all the evidence base around what great wellbeing looks like through all the leadership training that the college develops, line manager training in terms of what works, and we are providing some element of training around that as part of the national service. We're running executive workshops for people who are leading on this agenda in the organisation, where we bring people together and we provide them with support in terms of how to create a plan, how to develop a really good sense of staff engagement around the work that you're doing, and an evidence base. If the executive and the senior leadership aren't bought into this, it just doesn't work. In fact, you can get real problems with it, we know that. Trauma, post-in support, disaster management. We've worked with Public Health England and several other experts to develop a model around this. That is currently about to be signed off nationally. It is a really important part of what we do to try to get the best interventions at the initial point of a crisis. We're looking at feeding this through all the gold, silver, bronze training modules so that people understand that this needs to be embedded in your gold, silver, bronze models. And we're also looking at, when I come to our vehicle fleet, having that on almost an MPOC level response so that we can provide this and the expertise around it to the force or forces that are experiencing a significant incident, so that we can get that diffusion and debrief done really high quality at the scene. And we did deploy 2 of our vehicles and some of that support to TVP recently. And that is something we want to build more and more on. But it's actually the big jobs we are doing a lot better at. There's 2 things with the big crisis that we have a challenge with. One is that everybody eventually moves on to a line manager. You cannot sustain the level of support into significant numbers of people. That's a big job over time. You can track them, you can psychologically monitor them over time as if you would with a physical injury, but in terms of them going back into the workplace, they all go back to us folk. And you have very little knowledge of what their prior experience is. I know this in my own force. I've got numerous people who've been exposed to really significant traumatic events. They transfer, for example, to my force. They go on a major incident team and they're put into the same environment because they haven't disclosed it, because they fear they might not get on the major incident team. And they're put in exposed again without us understanding that they're already probably working through some of their previous traumatic experiences. Psychological screening. We are providing up to 5,000 psychological screenings with an assessment, specialist assessment and referral behind it as part of the service. That's a very expensive part of our service. It accounts for getting on for 20% of our total spend. Helen Ball asked us to pick up the negotiator screening, which was funded for 3 years, then it ended, and we've said we will. We've done a piece of work to look in forces about who should be screened, and the higher risk roles won't surprise you. OCATE teams, some elements of CT where they're doing the image viewing, collision investigators. There's about 5,000 in that priority group that it's not that they aren't getting screening, but they're not consistently getting screened, and so the National Service will take that 5,000 on. And psychological screening, we think there's probably, from our work we've done with forces, 20% of the workforce already getting some element of screening. But we've got to work with forces because there's no point screening people if there's no referral support of what comes out of it. So that is a really important part of what we're doing. Individual resilience, we're doing tons of work around this, whether it's at line manager level. We've got programs that we're running about training people, train the trainer programs around individual resilience. One of the really important parts of this, I think, is the uplift. We've got 50 to 60,000 new people joining policing at least over the next 3 to 4 years. What are we doing for them before they even set foot in a stab vest, become a CSI or whatever other job they do, around giving them some of those resilience thinking skills right from day one. And we're offering to work with the national programme to develop some of that and provide it to forces in a train-the-trainer type of package. But what we'll do is we'll look across the world. We do a lot of work with Australian, American and Canadian law enforcement. We'll look at what everyone's doing, look at what works, and we've got the expertise to say this is the best in class, and we can provide it at scale and affordably. Executive leadership, more and more work with senior teams around creating a plan. Wellbeing is a bit of a sort of nebulous, it's everything in an organisation, and a lot of it is cultural. And so we know that people want to know how to develop a decent plan. You know, where do I fit into this? What is it I need to do on a day-to-day basis? I'm looking at this in Lancashire because although we've got a lot of effort in Lancashire, we haven't really got, I don't think, a comprehensive plan that really does describe all the sort of things that we want to do. And my plan sort of reflects a lot of the stuff that's in this list. Wellbeing at work, we're doing peer reviews with other forces. So we've done North Wales, Hampshire, I think we've got Cleveland and I've forgotten the other force, sorry, that we're doing. But we're doing peer reviews where we send a team of people in, work with the force to do some reality checking, look at what their assumptions are about how they're doing and help them do sort of continuous improvement. We do think peer review works really well for this type of thing rather than you know, heavy inspection. But we haven't got the capacity to do that for every force at the moment, but it's going quite well. Peer support, a couple of things on this one. We've brought in a peer support model from Canada, Badge of Life Canada. We have seconded to us a PSNI sergeant who did a Churchill Fellowship, went all around the world looking at this stuff. There are critical issues in law enforcement in Australia, Canada and America around this issue. Fully armed, very strong, be strong culture, and their levels of things like self-harm and suicide are very significant. And they spend a lot of effort and time on it. We've brought the Badge of Life Canada over here and we've trained, I think, 14 forces in how to set up a safe peer support model, because peer support models are a massive opportunity. But you've got to set them up safely. They've got to be hooked into your PSDs, your line management, your occupational health, and they've also got to be supported themselves or else they'll burn out, because they're dealing quite often with complex, difficult cases. We've, as part of this, has done a piece of work around superintendents, peer support, what does good look like. Stuart has led on that, and they've done loads of interviews using Cardiff University. Have got a tried and tested model that's more tuned into the leadership issues that you find. All the things that come up in those conversations, Stuart tells me, are consistent with your last affinity survey. Workload, responsibilities, behaviours, culture, things outside work, resources, pressure. We're committing now to funding Cardiff University to develop a package to train people in that peer support model, and we will fund the training of that so it's rolled out across the superintendent associations over the next 12 or 18 months. So how we'll do that is that we'll put these training courses on, we'll invite super associations to nominate, and there will be some criteria about who you nominate, because I think some of Stuart's work has proven that it's actually up to the people in the association who they think would make a good person to be a peer supporter. It's not like a self-selection thing all the time, and we'll set that training up. There will be a form of accreditation with it, and people can then set up their own peer support models in their own forces. That's the sort of thing we're trying to do. We can do that quite efficiently by doing some of that ones. Other forces might already have some of this stuff in place, which is fine, but we're saying we can provide some of that for you through the National Service. And the outreach service, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute, we have 4 vehicles at the moment. We've got another 6 arriving any time now, fully kitted out. You'll be able to, you can, I think, we've got fleet management around that. You can book those online. You can work with your outsourced provider or your Occy Health, Police Mutual. Park these outside where people are working and grab them. We have had people come into these. These have already had thousands of people through them having physical and psychological health checks. And people are coming to them with critical levels of blood pressure just about to go to a job. That's mainly men, because they don't go to the doctor as much. We find psychological screening, we have got people who are scoring critical levels. And some of those questions are, I have considered taking my own life within the last 3 weeks, and they're on the way out to a job. And they filled it and they said, I'm busy, I'm off to a job. And you've got people there, professionals, who can say, do you want to make a referral? Do you want to come and see us? I think it might be a good idea. You've got to take the coals to Newcastle, because people do not want to walk into your site through the organisation corridors to your Occupational Health unit yet. In Lancashire, we were running at about 120 referrals into occupational health a year for psychological issues. Musculoskeletal stayed static. In the course of 18 months, that's gone from 120 to 600 a year. Now, that is because the people who work in Occupational Health are out and about, and they're turning up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do a critical incident debrief after a particularly nasty fatal, and the staff trust is starting to build. You cannot generate that level of demand from what is currently an unmet need. It's out there. It's not these 600 weren't there. They were there, they just weren't coming forward, without redesigning and investing in some elements of your occupational health, which is why there are 2 projects on this. One is occupational health standards. Anybody here from Devon and Cornwall? Well, it's an ARPO conference today. There's nobody from Devon and Cornwall there either. It's a long way, isn't it, I suppose? We've got Professor John Harrison, who's their Chief Medical Officer, working with us part-time, working with the Occupational Health Nurses Network to develop. There actually already are occupational health standards, we just don't apply them. And we're tuning these in to policing. And we will help people get there, but at some point, it will be mandated that this is a fairly standard, you should be able to get this if you work in policing offer, around timescales and type of provision. We have got a service, occupational health is under massive pressure. And we've got people doing things that, quite frankly, that they're not trained to do in there. So what we're doing so far, this is the Fed survey. People have been encouraged to talk about the mental health. Line managers feel confident to deal, but only 21.8% of them are trained, which is why we're doing a lot more training. My occupational health referrals and PTSD research from Dr. Jess Miller that the Police Care UK funded would suggest that up to 20% of our police officers have got either PTSD or complex PTSD. That's 1 in 5. That is huge, if that's the case. And that was a survey of 18,000 staff. We've got the Oscar Kilo website. There's loads of stuff on there. We're building it up all the time. There's certain tiered access on there. We're making it sort of open access now. There is a very popular mindfulness course on there that's been provided, the Blue Light Framework, there's research, guidance, all sorts of stuff coming in there. There will be published on there, for example, what good looks like in terms of gold, silver, bronze for crisis management debrief. And we will be able to advise and help forces who are wanting to get on top of that type of thing. These are the vans, they're kitted out, and I think this is probably one of the highest impact for the front line, because when I've been out to them in my force, what you see is quite a good sort of, you see a really good sense of the fact that, well, I've heard you talk about this stuff, but what does it actually mean to me? I've had so much feedback from people who've said, collision investigator emailed me and said, I thought Wellbeing was just like the bosses talking a load of crap, quite frankly. I went to a particularly difficult fatal with a young girl, got back to the motorway base, and there's a trained trauma counsellor waiting for me. And he said, my superintendent's been great, my chief inspector's been great, my sergeant's been great. I'm struggling, but actually I wouldn't even be here if that wasn't all happening like a piece of a jigsaw. You've got to get this type of thing out there to convince people you're serious about it. Now, I put this up, the iceberg of ignorance, because you know, when it comes to what's going on in the workplace, the amount of change that's gone on in policing over the last 7 years is just immense, isn't it? I know Mike Cunningham talked to you about this. When I'm at the top of that there, I've got to accept, and this is something that all of us need to think about, is that actually I don't see as clearly the problems and the lived experience of the people in the work anymore. I have a view of it that's based quite a lot on how it was when I was there. If you want to really understand what's going on and not waste money and really hit the mark with your staff, you've got to do staff engagement that gets through this. And that is, for some people, quite a humbling experience, because most people like to think that they have all the answers to everything. But this is based on evidence around staff engagement. In our survey, I think senior people rate themselves good at change. About 65-70% of them on our survey said, I think I'm pretty good at managing change. When you go down the ranks and the roles in the organisation, that drops to about 20-25% thinking that we're good at leading change. So we're not as good as we thought we were. And actually, none of our staff are complaining about dealing with trauma. What they are saying is, you know, my cup is pretty full because of the nature of my work. You know, I'm not selling things for a living. I am dealing with really difficult stuff day in, day out. And when change is done, it tips people over. So how change is done is a massive, massive driver of workplace stress. And I'll come to a bit more about that at the end. So we are not as good at dealing with change as we think we are, and our IT systems are not good for people's health. That equals change. Yet resourcing equals change, and it's no good, me as a senior person, wandering around the organisation saying, looking at things through rose-tinted spectacles. You've got to listen to people who are in the work and say what's working, what isn't, without feeling as though it's your fault all the time that your force has bought an IT system that's making people sick. Because most of the IT systems that are available to us will make people ill. They're just not very good, are they? You know, and that's our fault. It's people like mine's fault. You know, why are we not a more intelligent customer to the commercial sector to say we keep buying these things, and it's like you've got 3 things, none of them are very good, and I'm buying the least worst one. And at least, don't get me on it, I still get hassle about it at work. And there's people from Lancashire in here, you know, I can't get through anything without mentioning this system. Connect, yes. You know, and you've got to buy something, haven't you? But we should have said, what is the user experience of this compared to what we're moving from? Because I'm telling you now, it has made people more ill than the work. I don't mind saying that, it has. And I wish I could wind back the clock 6-7 years, some of the decisions we made. You've got to take responsibility for it. Everything's my fault. Executive workshops. We talk about no room for heroes. Quite often we'll get people saying, I'm really committed to wellbeing as a senior person, but then they'll put themselves in quite a difficult situation that is actually not walking the talk on that, probably because they think they're doing the right thing. You know, I'm the person who's going to lead this job despite the fact I might know the family because I'm the SIO. That's what I do. You know, and you've got this sort of be strong mentality that to some degree is part and parcel of why we're a great organisation, because we do take a pride in dealing with trauma, don't we, and being there for people, but it's not good for your own well-being. And it also looks sometimes like you're saying one thing and doing another yourself. Wellbeing is the forefront, not the afterthought. If we'd have put wellbeing at the front of what systems we're buying for IT, don't get me on it. Yeah. Iceberg of ignorance, set the tone, invite challenge, personal responsibility, and trauma reframe. So I think, you know, I probably worry new recruits a bit with this one, but one of the things I say to them is, look, don't start thinking of trauma as like a bad thing. It is a bad thing, obviously, but we're here to deal with trauma. That's my job. I'm proud to work in an organisation that's there for people when things are really, really bad. It's not about surviving trauma, it's about equipping yourself with personal resilience and the services and the culture around you and the leadership so you can thrive in it. That is not easy, because this stuff, you know, some of the things that we see and experience are life-changing events. It is very, very complicated, but trauma, I personally do not come from the we've got to survive it camp. You know, the emotional survival camp. I think it's a negative spin on what is a very, very prestigious profession. And it's something that you will, most people I've worked with in my career see that end of the work as being, well, that's what my purpose is about. And they take a real pride in doing it well. So we shouldn't be, what we should be saying is the reason why we need to really tune up how we run our organisations, way beyond what Rolls-Royce, BP, all these organisations are doing, is because our people experience excessive levels of trauma exposure, and that has an effect on how much of the other stuff they can cope with. You will see people tipping over into crisis through debt, through becoming a carer, through having the locker moved from Burnley to Blackburn. And you will say, why has that person become awkward all of a sudden? It's not about the locker moving. It's like the argument you have with your other half, it's never about what you're arguing about. It's about the 20 things that have really hacked you off. And I think, you know, as senior people, I find that quite a useful perspective, because we deal with quite a few people who present to us as difficult, don't we? You know, a lot of people in this room on absence management, you will be the third layer, won't you, when someone's really, you know, they've gone to see an inspector, they've gone to see this. Eventually, when you've been off enough length of time, you go and see the super or chief super. You're seeing very complex cases, and some of the journey those people have had before they get to you and being very difficult, they're disengaged, you're into misconduct stuff. Some of it started out in this. It's got to be the case. So food for thought. Wellbeing is a great way to get behavioural insights that help you predict things like where change is going to cause stress. I'm saying that in the recent taser debate that we're having, when we're talking about a straw, where in that straw are the behavioural insights of our people? Because if our people are saying, I am not going to put myself in harm's way unless you equip me with a taser, that is a public safety issue. It's an organisational risk that you need to capture. And it's as relevant, potentially, as what the threat out there about people being assaulted or attacked with weapons might be, because that is discretionary effort, putting yourself in harm's way, and people can withdraw it. And the initial stuff I've been looking at when we've chucked it out to our staff is that some of them are saying that is the case. And we want them to stop people when there's 3 people on a car at 3 o'clock in the morning, don't we? You know, but there's a lot of stuff out there at the moment that the front line are seeing, and they, I think that perspective needs to be taken into account. Organisational stresses, let's run. You know, when you look at organisational stresses, IT, leadership behaviours, how change is managed, resourcing, workload, you know, it's how to run a great organisation. What I'm saying is, and I've said this to Martin, completely agrees with me, I've said it to a lot of chiefs, that let's learn the lessons of the last 7 years, folks. It has taken the wind out of a lot of people's sails. It's been hugely stressful. Let's not make growing the organisation more stressful than actually reducing it, because there's a lot of tension about at the moment around who's going to get what and this, that and the other, and I understand that is legitimate. But what we should be doing whilst we're trying to build the organisation up is run a better organisation at the same time. So, for example, I've asked my team to look at what is the big thing that came out of the frontline review. It was, I have not got enough learning time, so I can't learn all this stuff, and I have not got enough recovery time. We need to be building that into shift patterns, and we need to be taking some of the uplift to be able to enable us to do that, because we do not want to chuck 20,000 people at currently how it is. That is not sensible. 50,000 people at how it is, that is not sensible. And we're focused on prevention. So I've whistle-top through there. I can whiz back to any of the things on the live service or whatever. The only one I didn't mention, the two projects were occupational standards, and the other one was NHS. So the military, armed forces, have trauma-informed things like the GPs. So we know a lot of our people end up in the NHS system, but they are not informed about the lived experience of a police officer or police staff. And they need to be, because it changes significantly the decisions they make around that individual. And we have got the offer from the Royal College of GPs and Public Health England to do the same thing for policing, which I think will be a big part of the police covenant when we get kicking into that soon. So that's my presentation. Have we got time for questions, Paul? Or
We have.
Oh.
Come and take some. We have 11 minutes for questions. Anybody want to kick us off? I've got some on the app, so you don't have to. But if there are any questions that have arisen from what you've just seen, stick your hand up and I'll get a mic to you. Great, we'll get a microphone there. Anyone else after that? Sir.
So, Andy Foster from Humberside. We share your Connect pin. And the question is, really for the police service wider really, is when are we going to organise ourselves and start being a little bit more consumer savvy with these large commercial organisations who seem to be using us as free research and development?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just talked about IT and what you've got is you've got a system, haven't you, with 43 chief constables, 43 PCCs, and some of them like to do their own thing. And I think it's got to I think we've had our fingers burnt so much with moving off these legacy systems that the time is right for us to say, well, as a group of employees, why aren't we becoming a more intelligent customer with the commercial sector? Now, that, because the state we're in at the moment, with all the different systems we're on, is going to be difficult. But I think the police IT company, if they've got an ICT strategy, and I said this at Chief Council, then that convergence all onto the same systems that are properly commercially procured should be our objective. Now, they say, well, we'd like more chiefs to say that. Back in my IT department, they'd probably hang me from the rugby post for saying that, because everyone's got their own little views of what they need. But for sure, we are not engaging with those people, and we're getting sold systems that, if you were to cost the waste and time on top of what is, digital case file, for example, it dwarfs what it's actually cost you to buy it. And all the pain is at our end, and all the benefit seems to be at some other organisations.
But who can change this? Who's got...
Well, it is down to chief constables to sit down and work with, I think, with the police ICT company and say, right, even the procurement savings from going down that route are absolutely massive. And we've got to stop thinking that we can invent these things ourselves or go our own way. I mean, there's a lot of forces on Connect. I think Met, West Midlands, I think, you've got numerous forces on Connect. But we've bought really what we've been given. And if you look at what works with IT development, you get your people who are in the work involved in the development of it, so you don't end up in this situation. But it's people like my responsibility. But I'll tell you now, there's plenty of people like me who are saying exactly what I'm saying. The biggest pain that some of the chiefs I speak to have got is their IT. Either it's not stable, it keeps falling over, or the staff feedback around it is absolutely massive. And the waste it's creating. They put in a lot of back office in to make these things work. That shouldn't be the case.
Right, let's move on. Popular question, why do chief constables allow and even in some forces reward officers in the superintending ranks who work excessive hours? As the MPC lead for Wellbeing, how will you influence this amongst your fellow chief constables? That's from Simon Ovens.
Well, working excessive hours is... there's an element of our job, isn't it, that requires us to do it from time to time. I think if it's consistently, where it becomes the accepted norm that people are working long excessive hours, then it's role modelling from the top of the organisation, quite frankly. You know, because if people are all sat around going, I'm not going home until the chief's gone home, you get a problem. I spoke to one of our SAOs yesterday who's had a torrid time of it recently in terms of the amount of jobs he's doing. I know he is completely exhausted and his team are completely exhausted. What he wants to hear is, you know, me caring about is he getting a break. But he also needs to know that there's some hope in terms of the resourcing that that person's going to get to help sort out his problem. So it's not just fine words, you've got to back it up. And you've got to be honest with people. So he said to me, out of all this uplift, I need more detectives. I'm honest with you, they are not going to come in the first tranche because you've got to get new recruits in to release experienced people to be detectives. You know, 30 plus coming back in is a big opportunity. Give them a bit of hope, but do not try to you know, raise the hopes unnecessarily if you're not going to deliver it, is what I'd say.
But there is that other side. I mean, obviously a lot of the work that's done is because it has to be done, but every organisation I've been in, there is that element of willy waving, isn't there, where, you know, I'm going to be the last out, I'm going to send emails at 4 in the morning and I'm going to show everyone that I work harder than everyone else. And that takes leadership to crack it down on.
Yeah. I was going to say I've been accused of that, but that's... I mean, sending emails at 4 in the morning. I have, because I've got bad sleep, and I've been pulled up on that by people. But that's another issue. Have you got a culture in your organisation where people like superintendents, or actually your front line, and channels where they're going to say, I don't think what you're doing is right.
Yeah.
And they can walk in your office and tell you.
But that can't be very rarely a junior who can walk in and say, stop sending me emails at 4.
You see, people don't have to walk in offices. There are numerous ways you can get staff engagement through, where people can get an honest view through to the executive without feeling like they're going to be hung out to dry.
Yeah.
I think that takes years and years to develop, to be quite honest. But the working hours thing, I have quite an interesting perspective on this. We're working with... particularly Australians and Americans, fatigue management is something that we don't even talk about, is it? We've sort of institutionalised fatigue, as you say. It's like, well, that's how it is.
Yeah. Lunch is for wimps.
They are looking at fatigue and saying, well, why is it you can't drive a lorry, an HGV, for a certain amount of hours, but the police officer who's stopping them in a BMW X5 can have done 12 hours in a high-performance car with a gun in the back, and then knock them off for the tachograph not being right. Because if you applied that same legislation to police officers and some police staff, we wouldn't get the job done. And that's the position we're in. So that's why when we get the uplift, we've got to try to deal with some of those issues and front them up. Otherwise, we'll just end up with 20,000 more people who are fatigued.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else from the floor? I do have more questions. Ah, lovely, we'll get a microphone there. Anyone else after that? Oh, yes, is that a hand up at the back? Great, we'll have those 2 questions.
Sorry, Tracy Edwards again from the Met, apologies. I just want it bring you back to the numbers. And we've heard and we know that the superintending ranks have been particularly adversely affected. So when we're readdressing, are we looking at readdressing to the current levels of supervision rates? Or are we looking at reverting some of those supervision rates that have been more adversely affected than others? Okay,
well, I mean, I've talked to Paul about this, and I think what lies behind that concern is a legitimate lack of belief in the fact that the employer, i.e. Chief Constables, is going to look at that alongside everything else. Because in my force, if I get a big allocation over 3 years, of course I'm going to need more superintendents. Because I know the surveys say that, and I know that the numbers that have been cut, because I know what we used to have in Lancashire. How they're structured and stuff, I think, is a debate and a discussion I'd have with my super association. But I have regularly had conversations with people from my super association, some are in them, and say, what is it you need to get the job done? There's a different conversation now that the uplift's coming, because that will have a knock-on effect across the organisation. And I think people have got to have that honest conversation in their own forces, say what's the management structure going to be to deal with an uplift that is as big almost as the reduction that we had. But what have we learnt as well? Because I think we've learnt quite a lot about how we manage the organisation. That's, you know, probably better than it used to be 7 years ago. But I think that applies to chief inspectors and sergeants as well. You know, they're managing bigger areas. That I've got chief inspectors managing an area that a chief super, a super and 3 chief inspectors used to manage. So, you know, I think it's time to have a fresh look at it.
Chap at the back.
Afternoon, Mr. Rhodes. Jared Parkin from Dorset. I'm just curious to understand how the recent resilience survey that the Superintendents Association have carried out fits into your programme of work going forward, and what lessons you've learned and what you've taken from it.
It's interesting because we used the same question set and affinity to do the first time. I'm the chair of Supposer as well, so we did a Supposer survey for the first time, and our results were quite similar actually in terms of some of the findings from it. The work that I think we need to do primarily, I think there's a priority around peer review, peer support. I think at this level of an organisation, generally you get quite a bit of peer support. Certainly in Suppose you do when you're already in a pretty bad place. Yeah, we have the friend type system, and we're saying, well, we need that in all the time. And we need it for people who are newly promoted or under pressure. We need to be putting that level of support in earlier, and we need to have a proper structure around it rather than waiting until things go badly wrong, then putting the support in. So for me, when I look at your resilience survey and analyse it, there's people in there with critical levels of stress. There's elements of the behaviours of my peers don't help this. That is an issue that I think we need to take responsibility for, because, you know, if you're working in a culture or you're working in a role that is creating stress for you, that is self-induced, and it's something that we can do something about. So I think there's cultural issues, I think there's workload, there's levels of responsibility, and there's also this issue around, well, what have I got in place around my organisation to help me reduce the stress? And I think that's certainly what Stuart tells me to come out of the interviews in Lancashire. You know, particularly newly promoted superintendents are people who are feeling quite vulnerable in terms of the workload and their span of responsibility. It's absolutely huge, and the risk that they're managing.
We've got 20 seconds for me to ask you the final question, which was from Simon Nelson of Disabled Police Association. What have the evidence-based studies suggested in terms of how best to support the well-being of disabled colleagues who, after all, are not going to get better?
Yeah, this is something that we haven't covered yet in terms of specific disabilities, but I do think there's a whole piece of work for us actually. We're doing a national survey on wellbeing that's going to be sent out in October, to be done in November and published February and March. That is combined with a diversity and inclusion survey as well, the first one we've ever done nationally. Ian Hopkins and I are doing that jointly. It's part of my benefits tracking for my national service. But for him, that will cover a lot of those issues to find out, well, what actually is it that people are saying is affecting them in the workplace, whether it's about difference, disability, gender, whatever it might be. And therefore, we can get that information and start saying, what is it we're going to do about it? Because, you know, back to the previous question, what we're doing about supers, my position is we are 4 or 5 months into a live service. What I'm in a position to be able to do now is say to super associations, what is it you want? And I know people say to me, well, I want my chief to more supers and we need to stop this and we need to stop that. I am not able to fix a lot of the behavioural stuff like that, but I can lead horses to water and help them drink. And I think that is something that we're getting a little bit more momentum up now as things start to progress. This is a big, big agenda in government. And it's a big agenda for the Home Office and the college and everybody.
Well, on that note, Andy Rhodes, ladies and gentlemen, please give him a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.